The winter evening descended upon the Duke of Ashford's estate like a held breath, cold and crystalline and laden with expectation. Candlelight flickered against marble columns that soared toward frescoed ceilings, each flame trembling in draughts that crept through even the grandest of manor houses when December settled its weight upon the land. The ballroom glittered with the assembled luminaries of society, silks in jewel tones, uniforms adorned with medals that caught the light, the flash of diamonds at throats and ears and wrists, all gathered for what rumour had promised would be a most significant announcement. Lady Rosalind Hartley stood near one of the great windows, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon the sill, as though she needed its solidity to anchor herself to the earth. She wore a gown of deep emerald that her maid had insisted brought out the subtle green in her hazel eyes, though Rosalind suspected no one would notice, for she had long ago accepted that she was not the sort of woman who commanded attention when she entered a room. Her heart beneath the structured bodice was a tempest, wild and ungoverned, though her face showed only the careful composure she had perfected over years of concealing what must not be revealed. She had loved Edmund Ashford since she was old enough to understand that the peculiar ache in her chest when he smiled had a name, had guarded that love like a winter rose, protected beneath glass, beautiful, fragile, desperately sustained in conditions that should not allow it to survive. They had been children together, racing horses across the meadows that connected their families' estates, reading in the library while rain drummed against windows, sharing confidences in the unself-conscious way of youth before society taught them the dangers of intimacy. But time and duty had transformed the boy she knew into the Duke, had placed distance where once there had been effortless companionship, had built walls of propriety that she could not scale. Still, foolish heart that she possessed, she had nurtured hope. Tonight that hope fluttered in her chest like something winged and frantic, for Edmund had seemed different. These past weeks, seeking her out at gatherings, engaging her in conversations that stretched beyond mere courtesy, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The room smelled of hothouse flowers, their perfume cloying and almost suffocating, mingling with expensive French scents and the smoke of beeswax candles. The murmur of voices rose and fell like waves, speculation and gossip, dressed in polite tones. Then Edmund appeared at the top of the grand staircase, magnificent in his formal attire, every inch the Duke, and the room fell silent. Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs as he descended, as he moved to the center of the ballroom where a small dais had been prepared. Beside him appeared a woman Rosalind had seen only once before, Lady Constance Beaumont, recently arrived from London, celebrated for beauty that seemed almost unreal in its perfection, golden-haired and porcelain-skinned like something painted by masters. Edmund raised his glass, and the world seemed to slow. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly, "I have asked you here tonight to share news of great personal significance. It is my honor and privilege to announce my engagement to Lady Constance Beaumont." The words struck Rosalind like physical blows, each syllable a separate violence. The room tilted on its axis, the candles blurred into streaks of light. The voices that erupted in congratulation became distorted and distant, as though she were drowning. She could not breathe, her corset seemed to constrict, the air turned to glass in her lungs. She saw Edmund's face, composed and dutiful, saw him take Constance's hand, saw the future she had secretly harbored shatter into irretrievable fragments. Her vision darkened at the edges, her legs lost their strength, and before she could command her body to maintain the dignity that was all she had left, the floor rose to meet her, and the world dissolved into merciful darkness. Consciousness returned slowly, carrying with it the weight of memory that Rosalind would have preferred to leave in darkness. She became aware first of softness beneath her, a settee, upholstered in damask, and then of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones above her head. Her maid's familiar accent, threaded through with the Duchess of Ashford's more refined articulation, both women expressing concern that felt like needles against Rosalind's exposed nerves. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small parlor off the main ballroom, mercifully away from the assembled masses. The door closed against curious eyes, though she could still hear the murmur of continued celebration beyond. The humiliation that crashed over her then was worse than any physical pain, a burning mortification that started in her chest and radiated outward until she felt scorched by it. She had collapsed, had made a spectacle of herself at the Duke's engagement ball, had revealed to all who witnessed what she had tried so desperately to conceal, that she was a foolish woman, undone by hopeless love. "I must go home," she said, her voice emerging hoarse and strange. "Immediately." Her maid, faithful Mary, who had served her since childhood, began to protest that she should rest, that a physician had been sent for, but Rosalind would not be swayed. She could not remain here, could not face the pitying looks, or worse, the knowing smirks of those who had perhaps suspected her pathetic attachment. The Duchess, elegant even in her concern, tried to insist that Rosalind stay until she was stronger, that the Duke himself had asked after her condition, but that information only strengthened Rosalind's resolve. She could not, would not see Edmund, not now, perhaps not ever, for what could he possibly say that would not deepen her humiliation? As Mary helped her to stand and wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, Rosalind's mind churned with memories that now seemed painted in entirely different colors. She and Edmund had been children together, their families' estates sharing a border, their parents encouraging a friendship that had seemed natural as breathing. They had raced horses across meadows starred with wildflowers, had read books in comfortable silence in the library at Hartley House, had shared confidences and dreams with the easy intimacy of youth. But somewhere in the transition from childhood to adulthood, Edmund had changed, or perhaps she had simply begun to see clearly what had always been true. He had inherited his title at 20, and with it had come a gravity, a distance, as though the dukedom required him to seal away the boy he had been. Their easy companionship had become formal calls and proper dances at balls, conversations that skated across surfaces rather than diving into depths. Yet Rosalind, foolish heart that she possessed, had interpreted his occasional moments of warmth, a smile that seemed genuine, a conversation that stretched beyond courtesy, his habit of seeking her out at social gatherings as signs of something deeper. She had built castles from sand, had nurtured hope where only friendly regard existed, had made herself into precisely the sort of pitiable creature she had always scorned, a woman diminished by unrequited love. The journey home through winter roads was a blur of cold and misery, her tears freezing on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. By the time her carriage reached Hartley House, she had made her decision with the clarity that sometimes comes from devastation. She would leave for her aunt's estate in Scotland within the week, would remove herself entirely from a situation that had become unendurable. She must excise this love like a surgeon, removing diseased flesh brutally, completely, accepting whatever pain was necessary to survive. Edmund Ashford stood alone in his study as the last carriages departed down the lamplit drive, the sounds of celebration fading into winter silence that felt less like peace than accusation. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward him with grasping fingers, and he found himself unable to move from where he stood beside the window, his hand pressed against glass gone cold enough to burn. The engagement ring sat heavy on his finger. He had placed it there himself in a private ceremony earlier that evening, before the public announcement, and it felt less like jewelry than shackle, a circle of gold that bound him to a future that stretched before him like a prison sentence. He had done his duty, had honored the promise made to his father on that terrible day 3 years past, when the old Duke lay dying, and extracted from his son a vow that Edmund had believed himself honor-bound to keep, that he would marry Lady Constance Beaumont, cementing an alliance between their families that his father had negotiated in the final months of his life. Edmund had accepted this burden as he had accepted all the others that came with his title, had sealed away his own desires, such as he had allowed himself to acknowledge them, and prepared himself to fulfill obligations that transcended personal preference. But the image of Rosalind collapsing would not leave him, played again and again in his mind with excruciating clarity, the way the color had drained from her face, how her eyes had gone unfocused, the terrible grace of her fall as though something vital had been cut from within her. In that crystallizing moment, watching her crumple, something had shifted in Edmund's carefully constructed world, had cracked the armor of duty he had worn for so long that he had forgotten it was not his actual skin. He had moved toward her instinctively, had felt his heart stop in his chest, and in the space of her falling had realized with devastating clarity that he sought her face in every room he entered, that her opinion mattered more than all of society's combined, that the moments when he felt most himself were the moments spent in her presence, that he had been saving his genuine smiles for her alone, while offering the world only the careful mask of the Duke. His steward entered quietly to report that Lady Rosalind had departed for her family's estate and would be leaving within the week for Scotland, and the panic that seized Edmund's chest then was unlike anything he had experienced. Not when his father died, not when he inherited a title he felt inadequate to bear, not in any of the moments when duty had demanded sacrifice. The thought of Rosalind gone, removed beyond his reach, leaving because he had wounded her so profoundly that she could not bear to remain, made him understand what he had been refusing to see. He loved her, had perhaps always loved her, and in his devotion to duty and his fear of examining his own heart too closely, he had made a catastrophic error that might cost him the only thing that truly mattered. He reviewed memories with the new lens of this revelation, and they appeared transformed. Rosalind at 12, fierce and laughing as they raced horses across meadows, her hair escaping its ribbons and her joy utterly unself-conscious. At 16, reading poetry beneath the old oak that marked the boundary between their estates, her voice giving music to words he had thought he knew until he heard them shaped by her understanding. At 20, dancing with careful propriety at some ball or another, but her eyes holding entire galaxies of thought and feeling that she concealed behind social grace. He saw now how he had relegated her to safe in his mind, had taken her presence for granted, precisely because she was always there, constant as seasons, and he had never forced himself to examine the relief he felt in her company or the particular emptiness of rooms she had departed, had never questioned why conversations with her satisfied in ways that discourse with others never did. The realization was devastating in its completeness. He had built his prison with his own hands, had locked himself into duty while leaving his heart unguarded, and now faced the consequences of his blindness. Edmund did not sleep, could not sleep, for the revelation that had seized him in his study would not release its grip, and as the hours of night stretched toward dawn, he found himself pacing the length of his private chambers like a caged animal who has suddenly glimpsed open sky beyond bars he had not known were there. The fire burned low, and he did not call for a servant to tend it, instead lighting candles with his own hands, their flames casting restless shadows that seemed to match the turbulence of his thoughts as he moved between window and desk, watching the darkness beyond the glass, while his mind worked through the impossible calculus of duty versus desire, honor versus heart. By 2 in the morning he had summoned his solicitor from bed, poor Henderson, arriving in hastily donned clothes with alarm written across his features, and demanded to know the legalities of breaking an engagement that had been announced hours before, his voice carrying an urgency that made the older man set aside any protest about the unseemly hour and address the question with the seriousness it deserved. The engagement contract, Henderson explained with careful precision, was binding socially but not legally until the marriage itself was solemnized. Edmund could break it, though the scandal would be immense and Lady Constance's reputation would inevitably suffer despite any gentleman's attempt to shoulder blame, for society always judged women more harshly in such matters, and there would be whispers that she had been found wanting in some essential way. Edmund listened to these warnings as a man listens to concerns about weather when his house is burning, with acknowledgement of their validity, but complete disregard for their relevance against the magnitude of what he faced. For what was scandal compared to a life lived in the prison of wrong choice? What was society's judgment measured against the loss of the only woman who had ever made him feel like something more than his title? He made his decision then with a clarity that felt like the first honest thing he had done since inheriting his dukedom, made it knowing he was choosing the most selfish and yet most necessary path of his life. He would end the engagement, would break his father's deathbed promise, would accept whatever consequences came, because the alternative, a life without Rosalind, a future built on duty, while his heart withered from neglect, was no life at all, but merely a long dying. Henderson departed with instructions to begin whatever legal processes were required, and Edmund sat at his desk as night gave way to the grey promise of dawn, writing letters with a hand that trembled not from uncertainty, but from the enormity of what he was setting in motion. The letter to Constance came first, and he laboured over it with painful care, explaining the inexcusable that he could not marry her, that his heart belonged irrevocably to another, that he took full responsibility for the broken engagement and would provide whatever financial settlements she or her family deemed appropriate, that he knew his actions were dishonourable by society's measure, but that to proceed with a marriage devoid of genuine feeling would be a greater dishonor to them both. He sealed it with wax that bore his ducal crest, that symbol of all the duty and expectation he was now defying, and felt the weight of it like a judgment he willingly accepted. Then came the letter to Rosalind, and this he wrote and rewrote until his desk was littered with discarded attempts, each one inadequate to articulate feelings he had suppressed for so long that they emerged tangled and half-formed, desperately sincere yet sounding hollow, even to his own eyes. When rendered in ink, on paper, how could he explain years of blindness in a few paragraphs? How could he make her understand that her collapse had been the earthquake that shattered walls he had not known he was hiding behind? How could he ask for forgiveness when he had not yet forgiven himself? In the end, he wrote simply and with raw honesty that he loved her, had perhaps always loved her, and was coming to Scotland to tell her so in person, to ask not for immediate acceptance but merely for the chance to prove through actions, rather than words, that his feelings were real and lasting, and if she refused to see him he would understand, but he could not live with himself if he did not try. As dawn broke pale and cold across the estate, washing the winter landscape in shades of grey and silver, Edmund sent riders galloping toward London with his letter to Constance, and toward Scotland with news that he would follow within hours, and stood at his window watching the light grow and feeling simultaneously like a man who had just leapt from a cliff and a man who had finally, after years of confinement, remembered how to breathe. Edmund had barely finished sealing the letters and arranging for the riders when his butler arrived with information that stopped him in his tracks. Lady Constance Beaumont had arrived at the estate and requested immediate audience with His Grace, and the gravity in the man's tone suggested that refusal was not an option that would serve anyone well in the current circumstance. Edmund's first instinct was to refuse. Every moment delayed was a moment Rosalind travelled further from him, further into her exile and her pain, but he recognized that he owed Constance the courtesy of facing her directly, rather than leaving her to discover his defection through a letter delivered by proxy, however cowardly the easier path might have seemed in his urgency to depart. He received her in the morning room where pale winter sunlight did nothing to warm the chill atmosphere of anticipated confrontation, and he stood as she entered with the bearing of a man prepared to accept whatever fury she brought, knowing he deserved her anger and society's censure for breaking an engagement mere hours after its announcement. But Constance surprised him utterly, for she entered with composure rather than tears, with something that looked almost like relief rather than rage, and when she sat in the chair he offered gracefully, as she did all things, she studied him with eyes that held understanding rather than accusation. "You love her," Constance said simply, not as question but as statement, and Edmund found himself unable to dissemble or soften the truth. "I do," he admitted, his voice rough with the newness of speaking it aloud. "I realize that offers you no comfort and does not excuse the dishonor of my actions, but I will not compound my failures with lies. I love Lady Rosalind, and I cannot in conscience marry you while my heart belongs irrevocably to another." Constance nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap with the perfect deportment that had made her the darling of London society, and then she spoke words that Edmund had not anticipated. "I am relieved, Your Grace. I too felt the wrongness of our match, though I had resigned myself to duty as I believe we both had done." She paused, and something vulnerable crossed her beautiful features. "There is another, a gentleman of lesser rank, whom my family would never approve, and I accepted your proposal because I believed duty demanded the sacrifice of personal feeling, that to want more than an advantageous match was childish weakness to be suppressed." Edmund sat then, the weight of realization settling over him that they had both been prisoners of the same constraints, both trapped by expectations and family obligations that demanded the surrender of authentic feeling in service to social advantage. "I saw your face when Lady Rosalind collapsed," Constance continued, her voice soft but certain. "I recognized in your expression the mirror of my own hidden longing, the look of someone watching their heart walk away while duty holds them paralyzed. In that moment, I understood that we would both be miserable if we proceeded, that we would spend our lives as cordial strangers, sharing a name but never sharing the truth of ourselves." They spoke then with remarkable honesty, two people freed by catastrophe to acknowledge what neither had dared voice: that arranged marriages without affection were prisons that harmed everyone they touched, That duty without authentic feeling was a slow death of the spirit, that they each deserved the chance to pursue genuine love, even if society deemed such pursuit selfish or improper. Constance asked only one thing: that Edmund publicly shoulder the blame for the broken engagement, allowing her family to maintain that she had been grievously wronged, rather than admitting she was complicit in ending the arrangement. For a woman's reputation was more fragile than a man's, and she needed whatever protection his acceptance of fault could provide. Edmund agreed without hesitation, understanding that his title and position gave him armor against social consequences that Constance lacked, and he promised settlements generous enough to ensure no one could claim she had been left destitute or abandoned without care. They parted not as former betrothed but as unlikely allies, each freed to pursue the truth of their hearts. And as Constance departed, she turned at the door to offer him words he had not expected. "Go to her, your grace. Do not let duty or fear keep you from the love you have found. Life is too brief for such waste." Edmund watched her carriage disappear down the drive and felt the weight of obligation lift, replaced by the crystalline clarity of purpose. He would go to Scotland, he would find Rosalind, and he would spend whatever time she granted him, proving that his love was real and lasting and worth the scandal they would face together. Edmund departed within the hour of Constance's leave-taking, his coach laden with minimal luggage, for he could not bear the delay of extensive preparation, and as the wheels began their northward journey, through countryside still locked in winter's grip, he found himself suspended between desperate hope and suffocating fear, the landscape passing outside his window, becoming a blur of white fields and bare trees that registered only distantly, while his mind travelled paths of memory that suddenly held new and painful clarity. The journey to Scotland would take days even in favourable conditions, and the weather conspired against haste, as though the universe itself wished to test his resolve. Snow began to fall on the second day, thick and relentless, slowing their progress to a crawl as the horses struggled through drifts that grew deeper with each passing mile, and Edmund sat in the cold coach wrapped in furs that did nothing to warm the chill of anxiety that had settled into his bones. Watching the storm and seeing in its fury a mirror of his internal turbulence, the fear that he was too late, that Rosalind would refuse him, that he had damaged something precious beyond all possibility of repair. The forced slowness of travel became a kind of torture, each delayed hour an agony of helplessness, but it also became an unexpected gift, for in the long cold days, with nothing to do but think and remember, Edmund found himself truly examining for the first time what Rosalind had always meant to him, and the memories that surfaced carried the weight of revelation. He remembered her at 12 years old, all fierce determination and wild laughter as they raced their horses across the fields between their estates, how even then she had never let him win, simply because he was the Duke's heir, how her competitive spirit had delighted rather than offended him, how he had felt more genuine in those childhood races than in any formal dinner or society event. He remembered her at 16, discovered one summer afternoon reading poetry beneath the ancient oak on the boundary of their properties, how she had looked up at his approach, not with the simpering flutter that other young ladies had begun to employ, but with simple pleasure at his company, how they had spent hours discussing the poems and their own dreams for futures that seemed impossibly distant, how she had listened to his confession that he felt inadequate to the duties that awaited him and had not offered empty platitudes, but had instead said quietly that perhaps the awareness of inadequacy was what would make him a good duke, for it would keep him humble and striving. He remembered her at 20, dancing with him at a ball with careful propriety that society demanded, but he recalled now what he had not let himself see then, how her eyes had held depths that called to something in him, how her gloved hand in his had felt like an anchor in a sea of superficial social performance, how when the dance ended and she moved away, he had felt the absence like a physical loss, before pushing the feeling down and away, burying it beneath layers of duty and denial. Edmund saw now with devastating clarity how he had relegated Rosalind to a category in his mind labelled safe. She was always there, a constant presence at neighbouring estate and social gatherings, and he had taken that constancy for granted, with the thoughtless cruelty of someone who assumes the sun will always rise, never examining the relief he felt when he spotted her face in crowded rooms, never questioning why conversations with her left him feeling seen rather than performing, never acknowledging the emptiness that pervaded spaces she had departed. He had told himself their friendship was simple and uncomplicated, had convinced himself that the warmth he felt in her presence was merely the comfort of long acquaintance, had looked past her again and again in his search for whatever he thought love was supposed to be: grand passion, overwhelming attraction, the kind of romance that poetry described, and in doing so had failed to recognize that love had been quietly present all along, in every shared laugh, every honest conversation, every moment when he had been simply Edmund rather than the Duke of Ashford. The realization carried crushing guilt, for how many years had he wasted, how many opportunities had he missed to speak the truth of his heart, how deeply had he hurt her through his blindness, and the fear that gripped him as the coach struggled through another snowdrift was not merely that she would refuse him, but that he had no right to ask anything of her at all, that he had forfeited through neglect and thoughtlessness any claim to her affection, that he came to her now not as a worthy suitor, but as a desperate man who had finally recognized the treasure he had been discarding and wanted belatedly to reclaim it. By the time the coach crossed into Scotland on the 4th day of travel, Edmund had rehearsed and discarded 100 speeches, each one feeling inadequate to express the complexity of his feelings or the depth of his regret, and he understood with humbling certainty that words alone would never be sufficient, that if Rosalind granted him any grace at all, it would have to be earned through patience and demonstrated devotion rather than eloquent apology, and that the journey he had begun was not merely the physical miles to Scotland, but the much longer path of proving himself worthy of the love he had been too blind to value. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Rosalind existed in a landscape that seemed designed by some cruel providence to mirror the desolation of her heart. Her aunt's estate perched on cliffs above the North Sea, where grey water churned endlessly against black rocks, and wind howled through the bare winter gardens with a voice that sounded like mourning, and she found herself drawn to this wildness, to the raw honesty of a place that made no pretense of gentleness or comfort, but instead offered the fierce consolation of matching her internal devastation with external severity. She walked the cliffs daily regardless of weather, her cloak whipping around her as salt spray stung her face, and she welcomed the physical discomfort because it gave her something tangible to feel beyond the nebulous ache that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. The grief that was not just for losing Edmund, though that loss carved through her like a blade, but for the death of hope itself, for all the years she had spent interpreting small kindnesses as potential affection, arranging her life around the possibility of his regard, diminishing herself into a creature of waiting and wanting that she now viewed with something approaching contempt. She determined, with the fierce clarity that sometimes comes after devastation, that she would rebuild herself into a woman who did not need love, who found meaning and purpose in endeavors that did not depend on being seen or chosen by any man, no matter how deeply her treacherous heart might argue otherwise, and she threw herself into this transformation with disciplined intensity, rising early to help her aunt with the management of the estate and the charitable works that served the tenant families, visiting cottages where she brought medicine and food and listened to problems she might help solve, reading voraciously from her aunt's extensive library on subjects from philosophy to agricultural reform, filling her days so completely that exhaustion might grant her dreamless sleep. But the nights betrayed her, for in sleep her defenses crumbled and she dreamed of dark hair that fell across a forehead when he concentrated on reading, of eyes the color of storms that had occasionally looked at her with warmth she had foolishly interpreted as something deeper than friendship, of the way his rare, genuine laugh sounded different from his social pleasantries, and she would wake in the grey pre-dawn with tears on her face and anger at her own weakness burning in her throat, furious that her heart refused the reasonable commands her mind issued, that love apparently could not be excised through will alone, no matter how determined the surgeon. Her aunt, Lady Margaret Sutherland, watched her niece's struggle with the wisdom of someone who had herself survived heartbreak and emerged whole if scarred, and though she offered no empty platitudes about time healing all wounds or there being other fish in the proverbial sea, she provided steady presence and occasional observations that Rosalind filed away, even when she could not yet accept their comfort. And the days accumulated into a week, and then 2, and Rosalind began to believe that perhaps survival was possible, even if happiness seemed a country she would never again visit, that she could build a life of purpose and meaning, even if it would always carry the shadow of what she had hoped for and lost, never knowing that even as she walked those desolate cliffs, trying to scour away her longing, Edmund was traveling through winter storms with desperation, driving him northward toward the reckoning that would shatter her carefully constructed resignation and demand that she choose once more between self-protection and the terrifying vulnerability of hope. Edmund arrived at Lady Margaret Sutherland's estate on the 16th day of Rosalind's exile, on an afternoon when driving rain lashed the Scottish coast with the fury of a world determined to test any soul foolish enough to venture forth. And when he descended from his travel-worn coach in the circular drive before the grey stone manor house, he presented a figure so soaked and dishevelled that he barely resembled the impeccably composed Duke who had stood in an elegant ballroom making announcements that shattered hearts, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his coat heavy with water, his eyes carrying a desperation that could not be concealed behind any pretense of social propriety. Lady Margaret herself received him in the entrance hall with a courtesy that held distinct coolness, for word had reached even this remote corner of Scotland about the Duke of Ashford's engagement to the celebrated Lady Constance Beaumont, and she knew what devastation that announcement had wrought upon her beloved niece, and she assessed this unexpected visitor with the sharp judgment of a woman who had navigated her own share of heartbreak, and emerged with neither patience for romantic foolishness nor tolerance for men who wounded women through savant carelessness or cruelty. Edmund introduced himself with uncharacteristic humility, requesting audience with Lady Rosalind, and Margaret's expression conveyed her assumption that he came bearing pity or obligation, perhaps guilt-driven condolences for the awkwardness his engagement had caused, never imagining the truth that had driven him through winter storms and across the length of Britain. She left him standing in the entrance hall, dripping onto the flagstones, while she went to inform Rosalind of this unexpected caller, and in the drawing room where Rosalind had been reading correspondence related to her aunt's charitable endeavours work she had thrown herself into, with determined focus. She looked up at her aunt's words and felt the blood drain from her face, felt the careful composure she had been constructing over 2 weeks threaten to crack completely. Her first instinct was to refuse to see him, to send down word that she was indisposed or simply unwilling to receive visitors, to protect herself from whatever pity or awkward social obligation had brought him to Scotland, but pride, that fierce pride that had held her upright through humiliation and heartbreak, asserted itself, and would not permit her to hide like a wounded creature, would not grant him the knowledge that his presence affected her so profoundly. She descended to the drawing room where her aunt had directed him, and when she entered and saw Edmund standing before the fireplace, attempting unsuccessfully to warm himself, still wet from travel, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that bordered on desperation, she felt her breath catch in her throat even as she forced her expression into cool neutrality. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, a standoff of wounded hearts in a room where rain beat against windows and firelight cast shadows that seemed to deepen rather than illuminate, and Rosalind stood near the doorway as though she might need to flee, while Edmund remained motionless, neither of them knowing how to bridge the chasm of hurt and misunderstanding that yawned between them. Finally, Edmund spoke, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Lady Rosalind, I must speak with you, please. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I beg the favour of private conversation." Every part of Rosalind wanted to refuse, wanted to protect herself from whatever words he had come to deliver, for she could not endure his pity or his guilt-driven kindness, could not bear to have him witness how thoroughly he had devastated her, but something in his face, a vulnerability she had never before seen in the composed Duke, a rawness that suggested his own wounds made her hesitate, made her consider against all reasonable judgment that perhaps he had not come merely to salve his conscience. She glanced at her aunt, who stood near the doorway with protective concern evident in her posture, and Margaret gave the smallest nod, granting permission while making clear she would remain nearby, should Rosalind need rescue from whatever this encounter might bring. "Very well," Rosalind said, her voice carefully measured to reveal nothing of the storm raging within her. "The library will provide privacy." They moved in tense silence down the corridor to the library, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling, where rain streamed down tall windows overlooking gardens that had surrendered to winter's harsh rule. And as Edmund closed the door behind them, Rosalind felt as though they had been sealed into a grey cocoon, away from the world. Just the two of them, and whatever truths or further wounds this conversation might reveal, and she wrapped her arms around herself like armor and waited for him to speak words she was certain would break her heart anew. Edmund did not know where to begin, and the library that had seemed a refuge now felt like a chamber designed specifically for this confrontation, for the speaking of truths that might heal or irrevocably damage whatever fragile connection remained between them, and he began to pace with the restless energy of a man who had rehearsed 1,000 speeches during his journey north, only to find every carefully chosen word inadequate, now that Rosalind stood before him with her arms wrapped defensively around herself and her eyes guarded against whatever pain he might inflict. He stopped before the rain-streaked windows, his back to her as he gathered courage, then turned to face her with an expression that held none of the ducal composure she had always known, but instead revealed something raw and uncertain. "The engagement is ended," he said, the words emerging with quiet finality. "Annulled by dawn," after the announcement. Rosalind felt her heart lurch violently in her chest, a traitorous surge of hope that she immediately crushed with fierce determination, for she could not allow herself to be wounded again by misinterpreting his intentions or ascribing meaning to actions born of guilt or social obligation. She forced coldness into her voice, wrapped herself in the armor of formality that had always existed between them in public spaces. "I do not require a report of your affairs, Your Grace." The title struck him visibly, a flinch that he could not quite conceal, for it placed distance between them that felt like miles rather than the few feet of Turkish carpet that actually separated them, and she saw his jaw tighten as he absorbed the wound she had deliberately inflicted. Edmund moved closer, though he stopped at a respectful distance, and began to speak with halting difficulty about his father's deathbed promise made years ago when he was barely 20, about the engagement contract signed when Constance was still a child in the schoolroom, and he, a young man who believed duty was the highest calling, about how he had compartmentalized his life into obligations that must be fulfilled and desires that must be suppressed until he no longer knew how to examine his own heart or name his own feelings. Rosalind listened with her arms still wrapped around herself like armor, her mind screaming at her not to soften, not to let his explanations breach the walls she had constructed during 2 weeks of grief and determination, for she could not survive having hope kindled only to be extinguished again. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, and the question emerged sharper than she intended, edged with all the pain she was trying so desperately to conceal. "What possible purpose does it serve to come here and explain the circumstances of your broken engagement? Do you imagine I require consolation, Your Grace? Do you think I collapsed from some schoolgirl infatuation that needs your gentle management?" The words hung between them, heavy as the storm that battered the windows, and Edmund's composure, that careful control he had maintained even while speaking of duty and promises, finally cracked, his face transforming with an anguish that could not be feigned or manufactured for social purposes, and when he spoke again, his voice shook with years of repressed emotion breaking free. "I am telling you because I could not let you go on believing because you deserve to know." He stopped, drew a ragged breath, then continued with the desperate honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Why am I telling you this? Because it matters, Rosalind. Because you matter. Because I have been the greatest fool in England, and I could not bear for you to think that your pain was inconsequential or that you were not seen." The use of her given name without her title, the breaking of formal address, felt like a physical touch, intimate and shocking, and Rosalind felt her carefully maintained coldness waver even as she fought to maintain it. Edmund's composure, that careful control that had defined him for as long as Rosalind had known him, the ducal mask that he wore like armor in every ballroom and drawing room, shattered completely, and the words came in a rush, like years of repression, breaking through a dam that could no longer contain the flood. "Because when you fell, my world stopped. Because in that moment when you collapsed and I thought you might be truly harmed, I understood with terrible clarity that nothing else mattered, not duty, not promises made to the dead, not society's expectations or my father's wishes. Nothing mattered except that you were hurt, and I had caused it." He moved closer, though he did not presume to touch her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though he wanted to reach for her but knew he had forfeited that right. "Because I have been a fool, Rosalind, the greatest fool in England. I have taken the sun for granted and called it ordinary, simply because it rose faithfully every morning. I relegated you to safe, In my mind you were always there, always constant, and I never examined why your presence brought me peace, or why rooms felt empty after you left them, or why I sought your face in every crowd." His voice broke slightly, raw emotion stripping away the formal cadences of aristocratic speech. "I have loved you, Rosalind, perhaps all my life. Perhaps since we were children racing horses across fields between our estates. Perhaps since you were 16 and read poetry beneath the oak tree and I thought I had never heard words sound so alive. Perhaps since you listened to my fears about inadequacy and never once made me feel less than whole. I have loved you, and I have been too bound by duty and fear and blindness to name it, even to myself." The words filled the library like something physical, impossible to recall or unsay, hanging in the air between them with all the weight of confession and vulnerability, and Rosalind felt tears threaten behind her eyes, even as she fought desperately to hold them back, to maintain some fragment of the protective armor she had wrapped around her wounded heart. "You cannot do this," she whispered, and her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. "You cannot arrive here with pretty words and expect—" "I expect nothing," Edmund interrupted, and the fierceness in his voice was not anger, but desperate sincerity. "I have no right to expect anything from you. I have hurt you unforgivably. I stood in that ballroom and announced an engagement to another woman while you were standing there hoping, and I knew you were hoping. Rosalind, some part of me always knew, and I was too much a coward to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would have required me to examine my own heart and admit that I had been living a half-life, fulfilling obligations while denying myself any true feeling." He drew a shaking breath, his eyes never leaving her face. "But I could not let you believe, I could not bear for you to go on thinking that you were not seen, not treasured, not loved beyond all reason and sense. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I have been too blind and too bound by duty to tell you so. And even if you send me away now and never wish to see me again, you deserve to know that you matter, that you have always mattered, that losing you would be losing the best part of myself." The scene was raw and intimate, the formal language they had always maintained between them breaking down into essential emotion, and Rosalind felt her carefully constructed defenses wavering, felt hope that dangerous, painful hope she had tried so desperately to extinguish flickering to life again in her chest like a candle flame that refused to be snuffed out no matter how fierce the wind that battered it. But Rosalind did not collapse into his arms, did not allow the declaration she had longed to hear for years to sweep away the very real pain that had carved itself into her heart like words etched in stone, for the narrative honored her wound and her need for self-protection, understood that love, however genuine it might be now, could not simply erase the humiliation and grief she had endured, and she stepped back from him, with her arms still wrapped defensively around herself, as though she might physically hold her breaking heart together through sheer will. "You speak of love," she said, and her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. "But do you understand what these years have cost me? Do you comprehend what it meant to hope, Edmund? To interpret every small kindness as potential affection, every smile as secret regard, every moment of conversation as something that might mean more than mere friendship." The words came faster now, years of silent suffering finding voice at last. "I made myself foolish for you. I became a woman I despised, waiting, always waiting, hoping, diminishing myself to fit into whatever small space you might offer me in your life. I attended every social gathering where you might be present. I wore colors I thought you might notice. I read books on subjects that interested you so that I might have something worthwhile to say in conversation. I shaped myself around the hope of being seen by you, and all the while you were bound to another, and I was making myself into a fool." Her voice broke on the final word, and she turned away from him, facing the rain-streaked windows, so he would not see the tears that finally escaped, despite her fierce efforts to contain them. "When you announced your engagement to Lady Constance, it was not merely disappointment. I felt it was the death of hope itself, the extinguishing of a light I had carried for so long that I no longer knew how to exist in darkness. And the humiliation, Edmund collapsing before all of society, my weakness exposed for everyone to witness and whisper about that humiliation, burns deeper than you can possibly understand." Edmund listened without interruption, his face a portrait of anguish, accepting every word as deserved condemnation, and he did not attempt to defend himself or diminish her pain with platitudes or excuses, for he understood that she needed to speak this suffering aloud, needed him to truly comprehend the damage his blindness had wrought. When she finally turned back to face him, her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. "I will not return to that woman. I will not become again someone who waits and hopes and diminishes herself. I have spent these weeks in Scotland trying to become someone who does not need your regard to feel whole, someone who can exist independently of whether you see me or not. And I will not surrender that hard-won strength simply because you have finally decided to look in my direction." Edmund remained still, his hands at his sides, making no move to approach her or touch her, respecting the physical distance she maintained between them. "You were never foolish," he said quietly, and his voice carried none of the desperate urgency of his earlier confession, but instead held simple, sincere conviction. "I was blind. I was trapped by duty and fear and my own inability to examine what I truly felt. The fault, all of it, lies with me, and you should not trust me easily, Rosalind. I do not ask for immediate forgiveness or acceptance, for I have not earned either." Rosalind studied his face, searching for any hint of manipulation or performance, but found only raw honesty and remorse. "Then what do you ask?" she demanded, and the question emerged as both challenge and genuine inquiry, for she needed to understand what he truly wanted from this confession, what possible path forward he imagined after causing such profound hurt. Edmund drew a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice held a steadiness born of absolute conviction. The desperate urgency of his earlier confession now channeled into something more deliberate and considered, for he understood that Rosalind needed not passionate declarations, but rather something concrete and tangible, a path forward that honored both her pain and the fragile possibility that still existed between them. "I ask for the opportunity to court you properly, not as we have existed before, not as childhood companions who drifted into comfortable familiarity, but as a man who wishes to win the regard of the woman he loves." He moved slightly closer, though still maintaining the physical distance she had established, respecting her boundaries even as he offered his proposal. "I will remain in Scotland. If you permit it, I will take rooms at the village inn and call upon you properly, with all the formality and intention that courtship requires. You will dictate the terms entirely, the pace, the frequency of visits, the activities we share. If at any moment you wish me gone, if you find my presence burdensome or my attentions unwelcome, you need only say the word, and I will leave immediately and never trouble you again." His eyes never left her face, searching for any sign of receptivity to this unprecedented offer, for he was proposing something that flew in the face of every social convention. A duke courting a woman who had already been humiliated by his previous engagement, staying in a small Scottish village rather than attending to his estates and social obligations, subjecting himself entirely to her judgment and terms. "I ask for the chance to demonstrate through actions, rather than words, that my feelings are genuine and enduring. To show you that I see you, that I value you, that I choose you not out of guilt or temporary passion, but out of love that has finally been acknowledged and named. I ask for time to prove myself worthy of your trust, though I know I may never fully succeed." Rosalind stood silent for a long moment, her arms still wrapped protectively around herself, her face a battlefield of conflicting emotions that Edmund could read as clearly as he had once failed. To read her hopes, she was torn, genuinely torn between the self-protective instinct to send him away and never risk such pain again, and the part of her that had loved him since childhood, the part that wanted desperately to believe that this transformation was real and lasting, rather than merely the guilt-driven impulse of a man who had suddenly recognized the consequences of his blindness. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, sealing them in this moment of decision, and Edmund waited without speaking further, knowing that anything more he said would be pressure rather than invitation, would tip from petition into manipulation, and he had meant what he said. She must be entirely free to choose, must feel no obligation or coercion, must come to him only if she truly wished to, only if she believed the possibility worth the risk. Finally, Rosalind spoke, and her voice was cautious but not entirely closed. "1 week. I will grant you 7 days to demonstrate whether these feelings you profess are genuine or merely the product of shock and guilt and temporary conviction that will fade when you return to your familiar life and obligations." Edmund's heart leapt with hope he barely dared to feel, but he kept his expression controlled, serious, understanding that this was not victory, but rather the granting of an opportunity he had not earned and must now prove himself worthy of receiving. 7 days. I ask nothing more, and I am grateful beyond measure for even that much. I will not waste a single moment of the time you have granted me. He inclined his head with genuine respect, acknowledging both her authority in this arrangement and his gratitude for her willingness to allow him any chance at all. And Rosalind saw in that gesture something she had never witnessed before. Edmund, the Duke of Ashford, bowing not out of social convention, but out of authentic regard for her, treating her not as lesser or subordinate, but as someone whose judgment and choice held profound importance, and that small gesture did more to crack her defensive armor than all his passionate declarations had accomplished, for it suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, something fundamental had truly shifted in how he saw her and valued her place in his life. The first morning Edmund arrived at the estate, the sky had cleared to that peculiar Scottish brightness that makes everything appear sharp-edged and vivid, and Rosalind found herself standing at the drawing-room window, watching his approach with her heart, performing an irregular rhythm she could not control, for she had not slept well, her mind circling endlessly around the decision she had made to grant him this week, questioning whether she was being brave or merely foolish, whether she was opening herself to healing or simply to further hurt. He came on foot rather than by carriage, she noticed, and he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and when her aunt's butler showed him in, Rosalind saw that his face held both hope and uncertainty, as though he too had spent a sleepless night contemplating the significance of this opportunity and the multitude of ways he might fail to prove himself worthy of it. "Good morning, Lady Rosalind," he said, and the formality of the address was deliberate. She understood he was giving her the respect of proper courtship, treating this as a beginning rather than a continuation of their old familiar friendship. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, and offered him tea, and they sat in the drawing-room with careful space between them while her aunt worked at embroidery in the corner, serving as chaperone and silent observer. Edmund presented the parcel with an almost shy gesture. "I recalled that you favor chocolate, particularly the variety with orange essence. The village confectioner assured me this was made fresh yesterday. It was a small thing, this gift not extravagant or showy, not the sort of grand gesture a duke might use to overwhelm with his wealth and position, but it demonstrated that he had remembered something specific about her preferences, had paid attention to details she had not thought he noticed, and Rosalind felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly as she accepted it with genuine thanks. They walked that afternoon, Edmund offering his arm with careful courtesy as they traversed the path along the cliffs, and Rosalind found herself testing him in small ways, watching how he responded to silence, whether he felt compelled to fill every pause with words, or whether he could simply exist beside her in companionable quiet. "Tell me about your work with your aunt's tenants," he said, and the request surprised her, for it was not the sort of topic she expected him to consider worthy of discussion. Most men of his rank regarded such charitable efforts as merely decorative accomplishments for women, pleasant activities to occupy otherwise idle time. But Edmund listened with genuine attention as she described the families she had visited, the struggles they faced, the small ways she had been able to help, and he asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated he understood the complexities of rural poverty and estate management, and more than that, he treated her observations and insights as valuable rather than merely charming. The second day brought clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered, and Edmund arrived again in the morning, this time with no gift, but rather a question that cut more deeply. "I must know, Rosalind, do I misunderstand the magnitude of the scandal I have created? Do you resent that my broken engagement has made you the subject of gossip and speculation?" Rosalind appreciated the directness of the inquiry, the way he did not shy away from difficult topics or pretend that consequences did not exist, and she answered with equal honesty. "I would be lying if I said I welcomed society's attention, but I learned something when I collapsed at your engagement ball. I learned that I had already become the subject of pity and speculation. The poor Lady Rosalind, who clearly harbored hopeless feelings for the Duke. At least now, if there is gossip, it is because you have chosen me, rather than because I was pathetic enough to love where I was not loved in return." Edmund flinched at her words, at the reminder of how completely he had failed to see what everyone else had apparently observed, but he did not deflect or make excuses. The social consequences are severe. I will not minimize them. But Rosalind, they are utterly inconsequential compared to the prospect of a life without you in it. Society's approval or disapproval means nothing if I have lost you. They walked further that day, past the section of cliff where the path became narrow and rocky, and when Rosalind stumbled slightly on loose stones, Edmund's hand came to her elbow instantly, steadying her with a touch that was both gentle and sure, and she found herself noticing the small things, the way he looked at her, as though she were the only thing in focus, while the landscape blurred around her, the way he laughed at her sharp observation about the absurdity of society's rules with genuine delight rather than polite tolerance, the way he spoke of his own fears and flaws with uncommon honesty, as though he trusted her enough to show her the uncertainty that lived beneath his ducal composure. And with each accumulated moment, each small gesture of attention and regard, Rosalind felt the defensive walls she had constructed beginning to show small cracks, light seeping through gaps she could not entirely seal against the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, this transformation in Edmund was genuine and lasting, rather than temporary and guilt-driven. On the third morning, clouds hung low and heavy over the Scottish coast, turning the sea to hammered pewter, and when Edmund arrived, Rosalind found herself speaking before she had fully decided to, the words emerging from some deep place of vulnerability she had tried to keep sealed. I need to understand something. Why would you want me? I am not beautiful like Lady Constance. I do not shine in society. I am too bookish, too sharp-tongued, too much myself to be the sort of wife a duke should have. Edmund stopped walking, turned to face her fully, and the expression on his face was fierce, almost pained. Rosalind, your intelligence challenges me in ways that make me better rather than merely comfortable. Your genuine nature is a respite from society's endless artifice. Do you know how exhausting it is to live among people who say nothing they mean and mean nothing they say? Your face is the one I seek in every crowd, every ballroom, every gathering, because it is the only face that has ever felt like home to me. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something more intimate. And you are beautiful, though I suspect you have never believed it, because your beauty is not the obvious sort that society celebrates with such tedious predictability. It is in the way your eyes light with passion when you speak of something that matters to you, in the strength of your profile when you stand at the cliff's edge, in the curve of your smile when something genuinely amuses you, rather than when you smile out of mere politeness. Rosalind felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being seen with such particularity, and Edmund continued, his own vulnerability now matching hers. I have my own inadequacies, my own sense of being insufficient. Do you know what it is like to inherit a title at 20, to suddenly be responsible for thousands of acres and hundreds of people who depend on you, to sit in Parliament among men twice your age who assume you are merely decorative? I have spent years feeling like an imposter playing a role, trying to live up to my father's legacy, and never quite succeeding. He reached for her hand, then hesitated, asking permission with the gesture, and when she gave the smallest nod, he took it gently. With you, I am simply Edmund, not a duke, not a symbol of propriety or duty or ancient lineage, simply a man who is most himself in your presence, who does not have to perform or pretend, who can admit his fears and flaws and know that he is seen truly and not judged wanting. The intimacy of this confession, the way he had met her vulnerability with his own, rather than deflecting or offering empty reassurances, touched something fundamental in Rosalind, and she squeezed his hand in response, a small gesture but one that acknowledged what was building between them. The fourth day brought unexpected sunshine, brilliant and warm enough that Edmund proposed they ride as they had in childhood, and Rosalind's aunt provided horses from her modest stable, and they set out across the moors with a freedom that had been impossible in the careful formality of the previous days. Race me to that far ridge, Rosalind challenged, and without waiting for agreement she urged her mount forward, leaning low over its neck, and she heard Edmund's startled laugh behind her before the thunder of his horse's hooves joined hers. The wind tore at her carefully pinned hair, sending it streaming behind her, and she felt wildly, impossibly alive, all the grief and caution of recent weeks stripped away by speed and sunshine and the pure physical joy of the ride. Edmund pulled nearly even with her, and she glanced sideways to see his face transformed by exhilaration, years of ducal restraint abandoned to boyish delight, and she urged her horse faster, competitive spirit rising, and when she reached the ridge first, barely, by perhaps a length, she threw her head back and laughed with triumphant joy, and Edmund reined in beside her, breathing hard, his own laughter joining hers, and in that moment something shifted fundamentally between them, the careful courtship giving way to genuine partnership, the formal distance collapsing into something warmer and more immediate and infinitely more real, and Rosalind realized that she was seeing not the Duke of Ashford but simply Edmund, the boy she had raced as a child, now grown into a man she was beginning to trust with her carefully guarded heart. By the fifth morning, Rosalind woke to find her carefully constructed defenses showing fractures she could no longer ignore, and the realization frightened her more than she cared to admit, for she had spent years building these walls, and now they were crumbling under the steady pressure of Edmund's patient devotion, and she did not know if what she was seeing was truth or merely the elaborate fiction her desperate heart was constructing from insufficient evidence. That evening, as her aunt sat reading by the fire in the small parlor, Rosalind found herself confessing her uncertainty with a vulnerability she had not shown even to herself. "Aunt Margaret, I do not know if I am seeing clearly, or if I am simply seeing what I wish to see. How does one trust one's own judgment when one's judgment has been so catastrophically wrong before?" Her aunt set down her book with the deliberate care of someone who understands the weight of the question being asked, and she regarded Rosalind with eyes that held both compassion and the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had lived through her own disappointments and survived them. "My dear girl, you were not wrong before you loved truly, which is never wrong. Edmund was the one who failed to see, failed to understand his own heart. But as to your question, watch not what he says, but what he does when nothing is demanded of him, when he believes himself unobserved. Watch how he treats those who cannot benefit him, those who have no power or influence to advance his interests. Watch whether he sees you on your worst days, when you are tired or cross or less than charming, and whether he remains or retreats." Rosalind carried these words with her into the sixth day, when rain swept in from the sea and turned the world grey and close, confining them to the house, and she found herself suggesting they spend the day in her aunt's library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books that represented decades of collected wisdom and escape. Edmund's face lit with genuine pleasure at the proposal, and they settled into the companionable silence of two people who could share space without requiring constant conversation, and Rosalind tested him subtly by choosing a book on agricultural reform and estate management, watching to see if he would dismiss her choice as inappropriately masculine or beyond her understanding. Instead, Edmund leaned forward with evident interest. "I have been reading similar works. I have plans for my estates, reforms I wish to implement, though I confess I am uncertain how to balance modernization with the traditional practices the tenants rely upon." What followed was hours of genuine discussion, Edmund speaking of his vision for tenant welfare, improved housing, fair wages, his desire to be a duke who served his people rather than simply extracting profit from their labor, and more significantly, he asked Rosalind's opinions and listened to her responses with the attention one gives to a valued advisor rather than the indulgent tolerance one might show a woman dabbling in topics beyond her sphere. She spoke of what she had learned from her aunt's tenants, the practical realities that estate ledgers never captured, the ways that small investments in people's welfare return tenfold in loyalty and productivity. And Edmund took notes, actually wrote down her observations as though they were insights worthy of preservation and implementation, and Rosalind realized with a jolt that went through her entire body that he respected her mind as much as he claimed to love her heart, that he saw her as a partner in the truest sense, someone whose thoughts and perspectives would shape his decisions and actions, and this recognition, more than any romantic declaration or passionate speech, convinced her that perhaps, just perhaps, she could trust what was building between them, for respect was the foundation upon which lasting love was built, and Edmund was offering her both in equal measure. On the seventh morning, the final morning of the week Rosalind had granted him, the sky dawned pale and crystalline, washed clean by the previous night's rain, and Edmund arrived at his customary hour carrying no offering save himself. But when he entered the drawing-room, Rosalind saw immediately that something had changed, for his expression held a tension that the previous day's growing ease had softened away, and her aunt, with the tactical discretion of a woman who understood the delicate architecture of courtship, excused herself almost immediately, leaving them in a silence that felt suddenly fragile. "A letter arrived this morning from London," Edmund said quietly, and he withdrew a folded paper from his coat with the careful handling one might give a weapon, "and I thought you should know of its contents before we proceed with the day." He handed her the letter, and Rosalind took it with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sudden understanding that this was a test neither of them had anticipated, but which would nevertheless prove decisive, and as her eyes moved across the elaborate script, she felt the words arrange themselves into a portrait of crisis. Society had erupted in scandal over the broken engagement. Edmund's peers were demanding his immediate return to London to explain himself and make amends. There were veiled threats to his standing in Parliament and his position among the nobility, suggestions that his behaviour had been ungentlemanly and that Lady Constance had been grievously wronged, intimations that his reputation and perhaps even his seat in the House of Lords might suffer consequences if he did not make proper restitution and demonstrate appropriate contrition. Rosalind read to the end, then carefully refolded the letter, her heart beating hard against her ribs. For here was the moment her aunt had warned her to watch for what would Edmund do when duty called in its most imperious voice, when the weight of expectation and consequence pressed upon him, when choosing her meant definite loss and choosing obligation meant certain safety. She would not ask, would not press or manipulate or demand, for if she had learned anything in these 7 days, it was that love must be chosen freely, or it was merely another form of prison, and so she simply handed the letter back to him and watched his face, giving him the space to make whatever choice he would make without the pressure of her visible need. Edmund took the letter, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, and she saw the struggle play across his features, years of training in duty warring with the newer, rawer truth of what he felt, and then quite deliberately, with a finality that seemed to echo in the quiet room, he folded the letter once more and set it aside on the small table beside him. "I will write my response here," he said quietly, and his voice held a certainty that made Rosalind's breath catch. "For my place is wherever you are, and if society cannot accept that, then society can manage without me for as long as necessary." He moved to her aunt's writing desk, selected paper and pen with calm efficiency, and began to write, while Rosalind stood motionless, watching as he chose her not because she had asked or demanded or manipulated, but because when faced with the choice between her and everything else, he had decided she was worth the cost of everything else, and the letter he composed, which he did not hide from her view but rather wrote with transparent honesty, stated plainly that he would not be returning to London, that he stood by his choice to end his engagement to Lady Constance, that he would face whatever social or political consequences resulted, and that those who wished to withdraw their support or friendship were free to do so, for he had found something more valuable than their approval, and he would not surrender it to appease their sense of propriety. When he finished, he sealed the letter, set it aside for posting, and turned back to Rosalind, and she felt the last of her carefully constructed walls collapse like a fortress whose defenders had finally, gratefully, laid down their arms, for he had passed the test she had not named, but which mattered more than all the others combined. He had chosen her when it cost him something real, when it would have been easier and safer to choose otherwise, and that choice, made without coercion, in the clear light of consequence, told her everything she needed to know about whether his love was genuine or merely the romantic impulse of a guilty heart. That evening, as the sun descended toward the western horizon and painted the wild Scottish coast in shades of amber and rose, Rosalind found herself walking beside Edmund along the cliff path they had traversed so many times over the past week. But tonight, the familiar route felt transformed into something ceremonial, as though they were processing toward some irrevocable threshold, and the wind that swept up from the churning sea below carried the salt-sharp scent of both ending and beginning. They walked in silence for a time, each step bringing them closer to the promontory, where land met sky in a dramatic convergence, and Rosalind felt the weight of the week pressing upon her 7 days that had rebuilt what years had broken, that had shown her not the Edmund she had imagined loving, but the Edmund who actually existed, flawed and vulnerable and real. And she knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with girlish fantasy and everything to do with hard-won understanding, that she stood at a moment of choice that would define the shape of her entire life. When they reached the cliff's edge, where the land dropped away into grey-green water, and the sky stretched infinite above them, Rosalind stopped and turned to face him, and the words she had been composing all day finally found their way into the open air. "I have loved you since I understood what love meant. Edmund, since I was barely old enough to name the feeling that made my heart race when you entered a room, that made every moment in your presence feel more vivid and every moment apart feel diminished. That has not changed, though I desperately wanted it to, though I tried with every ounce of will I possessed to excise that love like a surgeon removing diseased tissue." She saw him begin to speak and raised her hand gently to still him, for she needed to finish this accounting, needed to speak all of it while she had the courage. "You hurt me terribly, not through cruelty or malice, but through blindness, and perhaps that makes it hurt more rather than less, to know that I was so thoroughly unseen by the person I most wanted to be visible to. The scar of that will not simply vanish, Edmund. It will be part of me, part of us, if we become an us. And you need to understand that there will be days when that old wound aches, when my trust wavers, when I need reassurance that I am not simply convenient or comfortable, but genuinely chosen." Edmund nodded, his face grave with acceptance, not trying to minimize or dismiss what she was telling him, and this acknowledgement of her pain, rather than defensiveness against it, steadied something in Rosalind's chest, gave her the courage to continue. "But you have shown me this week that you see me, truly see me, not as an ornament or a helpmate or a solution to the problem of securing an heir, but as myself, Rosalind, with all my peculiarities and sharp edges and inconvenient opinions. You have listened when you did not have to, stayed when it would have been easier to leave, chosen me when that choice cost you something real." She felt tears gathering but did not try to stop them, for they were not tears of weakness but of truth finely spoken. "And I find that I still believe in the possibility of us, despite everything, despite all my very rational fears and all the excellent reasons my mind can produce for protecting myself. My heart apparently has more courage than my mind would advise, or perhaps it is simply more foolish. I cannot yet tell the difference." Edmund reached for her hand slowly, telegraphing his intention, asking permission with his eyes before touching her, and when she gave the smallest nod, he took her hand with a reverence that made her breath catch, holding it as though it were something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. "I will spend my life earning your trust, Rosalind, not just this week, but every day forward. When the old wound aches, I will be patient. When you need reassurance, I will provide it, not with resentment, but with gratitude that you are willing to risk your heart again, despite having every reason not to." The sun had nearly reached the horizon now, and the light that bathed them was golden and transient, the kind of light that made everything it touched seem both more beautiful and more temporary. And Rosalind felt a smile begin, tentative but genuine, the first truly unguarded smile she had allowed herself in his presence. Then, "Ask me properly, Edmund. Ask me what you came to Scotland to ask, and let us see if we can build something real from these fragile beginnings." Edmund sank to one knee on the wind-swept promontory, where land surrendered to sky and sea churned grey-green far below, and the last light of the dying sun painted everything it touched in shades of rose and amber and gold, transforming the wild Scottish coast into something mythical, a stage set by nature itself for moments of irrevocable consequence. And when he looked up at Rosalind with eyes that held every vulnerable thing he had ever felt, she saw her own reflection there, not diminished or made small, but magnified, treasured, held as something infinitely precious, and his voice, when he spoke, trembled with an emotion too large to be contained by mere composure. "Lady Rosalind Hartley, you have been my conscience, when I was most in danger of losing myself to duty's cold demands, my joy when I did not even realize I was walking through grey emptiness, my home, when every grand estate felt like nothing more than an elaborate prison, even when I was too foolish, too blind, too bound by fear and obligation to recognize what you meant to me, what you have always meant." He paused, gathering himself, and she could see him struggling to articulate something for which formal language seemed suddenly inadequate, the careful words of their class failing before the immensity of what needed to be expressed. "You are the bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, brave enough to love when it brought you only pain, brave enough to guard your heart when I finally came to claim it, brave enough to risk hope again when every rational instinct must have screamed at you to protect yourself, and I do not deserve you, Rosalind. I know that with a certainty that will never leave me, but I will strive every day of my life to become a man who could possibly be worthy of the extraordinary gift of your love." From within his coat, he withdrew a ring, and Rosalind saw immediately that it was not the ostentatious diamond one might expect a duke to offer, not some massive stone meant to display wealth and status, but rather a band of warm gold set with a sapphire, the deep blue of September skies, her birthstone, she realized with a catch in her throat, something chosen specifically for her, personal and thoughtful, and entirely Edmund, the man rather than the title. "Will you marry me, Rosalind? Not because of duty or arrangement or social expectation, not because it makes sense on paper or satisfies our family's ambitions, but because I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become, because I choose you consciously and gratefully and completely above all else, above reputation and convenience, and the approval of a society that values propriety more than truth." The question hung between them, crystalline and perfect, and Rosalind felt tears spill hot down her cheeks, but these were not the tears of sorrow that had marked so many nights since the ball, not the tears of humiliation or grief or hope, dying slowly in darkness. These were tears of joy, of relief, of a future suddenly blooming, possible and real before her, and her voice when she found it was first a whisper, then growing stronger, more certain. "Yes, yes, Edmund, I will marry you." And when he slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, when he rose and cupped her face with such infinite tenderness that she felt herself transformed from merely seen to truly cherished, when he kissed her with years of repressed longing, finally freed, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, equal relief, equal joy, the narrative of their lives shifted irrevocably from separate stories of duty and hidden feeling into a single story of chosen love, and the sea wind that swept around them, and the last gold light that bathed them, and the wild beauty of the Scottish coast all seemed to bear witness to this moment that was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, the closing of years of blindness and pain, and the opening of a future built not on arrangement or obligation, but on the radical, transformative choice to see and be seen, to love and be loved, to build something real and lasting from the fragile, precious materials of two hearts, finally, gratefully, coming home. They returned to England as winter surrendered reluctantly to early spring, and the journey south felt entirely different from Edmund's desperate flight north weeks earlier, where before he had travelled alone through storms of weather and heart. Now Rosalind sat beside him in the carriage, her hand in his, and the tentative green appearing on bare branches seemed to mirror the cautious hope growing between them, fragile but persistent, pushing through frozen ground toward light. But if the natural world welcomed the changing season with unquestioning acceptance, London society proved far less accommodating, and the scandal that had been brewing in their absence had fermented into something toxic and pervasive, whispered in drawing rooms and shouted in scandal sheets, dissected over tea and condemned from pulpits. The Duke of Ashford, that paragon of duty and propriety, had broken a formal engagement mere hours after announcing it, had abandoned a celebrated beauty for a woman society had scarcely noticed, had chosen personal inclination over familial obligation and social expectation, and the Tun simply did not know what to make of such unprecedented behaviour from one of their most respected peers. The first test came at Lady Melbourne's spring ball, an event neither could avoid without appearing to hide in shame, and when Edmund and Rosalind entered the glittering ballroom together, she wearing sapphire silk that matched her engagement ring, he with his hand proprietarily at the small of her back, the conversation did not merely pause, but stopped entirely, hundreds of faces turning toward them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt, and Rosalind felt her courage waver for just a moment before Edmund's hand pressed gently against her spine, steadying her, reminding her without words that she did not face this alone. They weathered the cut direct from several prominent matrons, the way certain groups turned their backs with deliberate rudeness, the whispers that were clearly meant to be overheard. "Fortune hunter," someone said, and "trapped him somehow," another voice added, and "poor Lady Constance, humiliated so publicly." But Edmund's response to each slight was the same calm dignity, making clear through posture and unwavering attention to Rosalind that his choice was final and unregretted, that no amount of social pressure would alter what had been decided in Scotland on windswept cliffs far from London's judgment. Then, like a ship changing course in response to shifted wind, the entire evening transformed when Lady Constance Beaumont herself entered the ballroom on the arm of a gentleman, society recognized as Thomas Barnaby, second son of Baron Wessex, respectable but hardly a spectacular match, and Constance's face glowed with such unmistakable happiness that it rendered her celebrated beauty almost incandescent, and she walked directly across that silent, watching ballroom to where Edmund and Rosalind stood, isolated, and extended her hands to them both with genuine warmth. "Your Grace," she said to Edmund, loudly enough that those nearby could hear clearly. "And Lady Rosalind, I am so pleased to see you both looking so well, and I must take this opportunity to publicly express my gratitude for your honorable handling of what could have been a most difficult situation, for you recognized what I was too bound by duty to acknowledge, that we would have made each other perfectly miserable, and you had the courage to act on that recognition, freeing us both to find our true happiness." She turned then to introduce Mr. Barnaby, who bowed respectfully, and Constance's voice carried across the attentive ballroom as she continued. "I am delighted to announce my own engagement to Mr. Barnaby, whom I have loved since we were children but thought myself too ambitious to accept, and I have the Duke of Ashford to thank for showing me that duty without authentic feeling serves no one, that we owe ourselves and those we promise ourselves to the truth of genuine affection rather than the hollow performance of appropriate matches." The effect was immediate and dramatic if Lady Constance herself harbored no resentment, if she publicly endorsed the broken engagement as mutually beneficial, if she stood before society glowing with her own scandalous love match and credited Edmund with liberating rather than humiliating her, then the narrative society had been constructing collapsed entirely and reformed into something else, something almost romantic, and by the time the ball ended, whispers had shifted from condemnation to cautious approval, from scandal to love story. And Rosalind discovered something unexpected in herself. She did not shrink beneath society's scrutiny or apologize for being chosen, did not make herself smaller to fit their expectations or sweeter to win their approval, but rather stood beside Edmund as an equal partner in their mutual choice. And that strength, that refusal to diminish herself, gradually earned a respect that mere propriety never could have commanded, and society, which could condemn what it did not understand, but eventually accepted what it could not change, slowly made peace with the Duke of Ashford's unprecedented devotion to the woman he had almost lost, the woman who had collapsed when he chose duty, but stood strong when he finally, gratefully, chose love. The wedding took place in late spring, when the world had fully awakened from winter's grip, and the estate chapel at Ashford overflowed with apple blossoms and white roses, their fragrance so thick it felt like walking through clouds of perfume, and though many of the ton's most prominent families found themselves conspicuously absent, unable to reconcile their disapproval with the social necessity of witnessing a duke's marriage, those who came did so with genuine affection rather than mere obligation, and that made all the difference. Transformed what might have been a somber affair, conducted under society's judgmental gaze, into something warmer, more intimate, a celebration rather than a performance. Rosalind walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing ivory silk that caught the light streaming through stained glass windows and scattered it into rainbow fragments across stone floors, and she carried not the elaborate bouquet tradition demanded, but rather a simple gathering of wildflowers she and Edmund had picked together the previous day from the meadow where they used to play as children, violets and primrose and forget-me-nots, humble and honest, and infinitely more meaningful than hothouse perfection. And when Edmund turned to watch her approach, his face held such unguarded emotion that several guests found themselves unexpectedly moved, for here was a man who did not hide his feelings behind aristocratic reserve, but rather let his love shine plain and clear for anyone willing to see. The ceremony itself followed traditional forms, the ancient words spoken in the chapel where Ashford dukes had married for generations, but when Edmund and Rosalind exchanged their vows, there was nothing rote or performed in their voices. Each promise landed with weight and intention, each word chosen consciously rather than simply repeated, and when Edmund said, "I take you, Rosalind," not from duty or obligation, but from joy, from gratitude, from love that has finally found courage to speak its name, There was not a dry eye among those gathered, for they were witnessing something increasingly rare in their world of arranged marriages and strategic alliances. Two people binding themselves together because they genuinely chose each other, because they had counted the cost and decided that whatever society might say or scandal might threaten, they would rather face it together than live separately in comfortable misery. The wedding breakfast afterward was less formal than such occasions typically demanded, with laughter more prevalent than strict protocol, and at one point Edmund stood and raised his glass, not with the usual brief toast, but with words that came straight from his undefended heart. "To my wife," he said, and the words seemed to fill him with wonder, "who collapsed when I was too blind to see what stood before me, who had every reason to refuse me when I finally came to my senses, who gave me a chance I did not deserve and showed me that love, real love, the kind that transforms rather than merely decorates, a life requires courage from both parties, the courage to be seen completely and to see completely in return, and I promise before all of you that I will spend every day of my life being worthy of the extraordinary gift of her presence, her partnership, her love." Rosalind rose then and took his hand, and though ladies did not typically speak at such occasions, she did so anyway because that was who they were becoming together, people who honored what mattered over what was expected, and she said simply, "And I promise to remind you on difficult days that we chose this, that we choose this still, that choosing each other again and again is what will make this marriage not just a contract, but a living thing that grows and changes and deepens with time." And the way Edmund looked at her in that moment, the way he brought her hand to his lips with such reverence, spoke more eloquently than any prepared speech about the nature of what they had found together.